Amira Al-Fayed wasn't just any young woman. She was the only daughter of one of the wealthiest billionaires in the Arab world, a man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms and whispers of envy in high society. From the outside, her life was nothing short of a fairy tale. Ornate palaces, lavish parties, designer outfits flown in from Paris, and every whim granted at the snap of her manicured fingers. But behind the gilded gates of her family's estate lay a secret. Amira's life was not her own. She was, in essence, a bird trapped in the golden cage of her father's legacy. Her every move watched, her every step planned. And her father, oh, he wasn't about to take chances. A billionaire with no room for errors, he had hired the most elite security to keep his precious gem untouchable. Her latest shadow, Omar, a man so stern he could make a statue look lively. He followed her around like a second shadow, towering over her every move with those sharp, piercing eyes and a jawline carved from steel. At first sight, Amira decided he was insufferable. He barked orders like he was commanding a battalion, dictated curfews, and even dared to question her favorite choice of high heels. Not practical for a quick escape, he had said once, his voice dripping with that cool military calm that irritated her to her core. Amira, of course, had rolled her eyes so hard she swore she almost saw the inside of her skull. Escape from what? She had snapped. Bad fashion choices. But underneath that annoyance, oh, there was a spark, a flicker of curiosity that Amira wasn't ready to admit. And that spark, it was about to grow into something far more dangerous than either of them could ever anticipate. Amira was no stranger to charming people. Growing up surrounded by diplomats, businessmen, and royalty, she'd mastered the art of playful rebellion. A carefully calculated smirk here, a well-timed sarcastic jab there. She knew how to get what she wanted. But Omar, he was an entirely different challenge. He wasn't fazed by her beauty or her wealth, and that drove her absolutely mad. Every time she sashayed past him in one of her meticulously chosen designer gowns, he barely blinked. Not even when she'd accidentally spilled her sparkling water on his spotless uniform, batting her long lashes with an insincere apology. Accidents happen, he'd muttered, stone-faced, handing her a towel with maddening calm. Seriously? No reaction at all? It was infuriating, and that's when the games began. Amira made it her mission to push Omar's limits. She snuck out of the estate one night to go to an exclusive rooftop party in downtown Dubai. A glittering sea of influencers, flashing cameras, and rooftop infinity pools. It was the perfect escape from her perfectly dull life. She was sipping a cocktail and enjoying the warm desert breeze when she felt it, the unmistakable weight of someone's gaze slicing through the crowd like a laser. Of course, it was Omar, dressed sharply in black, blending into the shadows like he owned them. He was standing near the edge of the party, arms crossed, eyes locked onto her. No judgment, no panic, just an intense, smoldering stare that sent a shiver down her spine. Amira raised her glass to him, smirking defiantly. If she was going to play with fire, she'd enjoy every spark. But the fire burned brighter than she expected. Within moments, he was beside her, his voice a low, steady growl in her ear. "Miss Al-Fayed, it's time to leave." Amira leaned in closer, letting her lips curve into a mischievous smile. "Why? Are you worried about me, Omar? Or worried about losing your job?" For a second, just a fleeting second, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Was that a suppressed smile? Or just her imagination? Before she could figure it out, he leaned in even closer, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. Both. Let's go. With that, he gently took her arm and led her toward the exit, leaving the glittering party behind. She didn't know what shocked her more, the fact that she actually obeyed, or the way his hand lingered ever so slightly on hers. Was it the thrill of defying her father that had her pulse racing, or something else entirely? Amira wasn't sure. All she knew was this: Omar wasn't as immune to her as he pretended to be. The ride back to the estate was anything but quiet. Amira leaned back in the leather seat of the black SUV, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the console as she stole glances at Omar, who was focused on the road like it was the only thing keeping him sane. "Relax, Omar," she teased, breaking the silence. "It was just a party, not a hostage situation." Omar didn't respond immediately, his sharp profile catching the glow of passing streetlights. "Your father doesn't hire me to relax," he finally said, his tone calm but firm. "Oh, we all know that," Amira shot back with a dramatic sigh, turning to face him fully now. "But seriously, you can't just lock me away like some antique vase in a glass case. I need to live a little. Breathe. Do you even know what that feels like?" For the first time, Omar's grip on the steering wheel tightened, a flicker of something. Frustration? Amusement? Passing across his face. "Breathe, Miss Al-Fayed. Sneaking off to rooftop parties with strangers who barely know your name, that's what you call breathing?" Amira tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "And what about you? Do you even have a life outside of trailing me everywhere? Or is being my personal shadow your grand adventure?" Omar glanced at her briefly, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. "My job is to keep you safe. That's all that matters." "Safe," Amira repeated with a soft laugh, shaking her head. "That's such a boring word. Safe is just another way of saying caged. But don't worry, Omar. I'll find a way to crack that armor of yours eventually. Everyone has a weakness, even you." His silence spoke volumes, but it wasn't the cold dismissal she was used to. It was heavier, layered with unspoken words, as if her challenge had struck a nerve. For a split second, his jaw tightened, his fingers flexed on the wheel, but he said nothing. When they pulled up to the estate, Omar exited the car first, moving to open the door for her. "Home safe, as promised," he said, his voice back to its usual professional calm, though his gaze lingered on hers just a moment too long. Amira stepped out, deliberately brushing past him with a sly smirk. "Good night, Omar," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with playful mischief. As she walked up the marble steps of the grand entrance, she felt his eyes on her, steady, watchful, and undeniably intense. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just a game. Beneath Omar's disciplined exterior, there was a man fighting his own battles, and she couldn't wait to see how far she could push him before his walls came tumbling down. The door closed behind her with a quiet thud, but her heart was far from still. Was it the thrill of defiance that had her pulse racing? Or was it Omar himself, with that maddening mix of mystery and resolve? Whatever it was, she wasn't going to let it go. Not yet. The next morning, Amira awoke to sunlight, streaming through her grand bedroom's floor-to-ceiling windows. She stretched lazily, glancing at the clock. It was nearly noon. Not that time held much meaning in her carefully orchestrated life. Her schedule was planned to perfection by her father's assistance, ensuring every moment was productive or appropriate for someone of her stature. But today, she had her own plans. Plans that, she was certain, would test Omar's composure even further. Downstairs, she found him standing near the entrance, already dressed in his usual black suit, perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable as always. It annoyed her just how effortless he made, looking like a living fortress seam. "Good morning, Omar," she greeted him with a radiant smile, tilting her head. "Sleep well?" "Miss Al-Fayed," he replied with a slight nod, ignoring her question entirely. "Your itinerary for today has been adjusted. Your father insisted on security training this afternoon. He believes you should be more prepared for emergencies." Amira almost choked on her coffee. "Security training? You're joking." "I don't joke," he said, the ghost of a smirk playing on his lips, a tiny crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor that only fueled her determination. "Well, I'm not spending my day pretending to be a soldier." "Cancel it," she said lightly, brushing past him toward the grand staircase. "Not an option," Omar called after her, his tone firm but patient. Amira stopped mid-step and turned, placing her hands on her hips. "You know, you could try being a little less robotic. Ever thought of cracking a smile? Laughing? Living, perhaps?" Omar raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. His silence was infuriating. "Oh, fine," she sighed dramatically, "but I'm going shopping first. You can babysit me through that instead." Omar gave a slight shrug. "Shopping or training, my job is to keep you safe. Do as you please." Her eyes gleamed with mischief. Oh, she planned to do exactly that. 2 hours later, the two of them were strolling through a luxurious Dubai mall. Amira flitted from store to store, indulging in every whim, while Omar trailed behind like a silent shadow. She tried on an endless array of dresses, each more dazzling than the last, purposely prolonging the experience just to see how long his patience would last. Finally, she emerged from a dressing room in a striking emerald green gown that hugged her figure perfectly. She glanced at Omar, who had positioned himself near the store's entrance, his back against the wall, scanning the room with military precision. "You haven't said a word about any of my outfits," she called out to him, her voice loud enough to turn heads. Omar's gaze shifted to her, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in his expression. Admiration, perhaps. If it was there, it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I'm not here to give fashion advice," he said coolly. Amira twirled in the gown, smirking. "Pity. I was hoping for a reaction. But I guess even I can't crack steel, can I?" Omar stepped forward, his tone lower now, just enough for her to hear. "Miss Al-Fayed, if I reacted to everything you did, you'd never stop testing me." Her lips parted slightly, caught off guard by his directness. For a moment, she didn't have a clever retort. The tension between them was electric, the air charged with unspoken challenges and unacknowledged truths. "Touché," she said finally, her voice softer. "But one day, Omar, I will get a reaction from you. Mark my words." He held her gaze for a fraction too long before stepping back, resuming his watchful stance. Amira returned to the dressing room, her heart racing, a smirk creeping onto her lips. This game they were playing, it was getting far more thrilling than she'd expected, and she wasn't about to let it end anytime soon. The car ride back from the mall was quieter than usual, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that came from peace. No, it was the crackling kind, the unspoken tension filling the air like static electricity. Amira, reclining lazily in the back seat, occasionally glanced up at Omar through the rearview mirror. He was driving, as stoic as ever, eyes locked on the road, like he was escorting her through a battlefield instead of a bustling Dubai boulevard. But she could feel it. Beneath his calm exterior, there was something there, an unspoken energy he was trying desperately to keep bottled up. And Amira, she lived for breaking bottles. "Is it always like this with you?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I mean, do you ever relax? Laugh, maybe? Or do you go to sleep in that suit, ready for war at a moment's notice? I sleep just fine, Miss Al-Fayed, Omar replied, without so much as a glance. Do you? Amira pressed, leaning forward. Because you look like you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, or at least the weight of one stubborn heiress. Omar's lips twitched, just a fraction, but he quickly hid it behind that infuriating mask of his. Keeping you out of trouble is no small task, he said dryly. Amira laughed, a melodic sound that filled the car. Trouble? Please, I'm giving you free entertainment. Admit it, your life would be unbearably boring without me. Boring is safe, Omar said simply. Amira leaned closer, propping her chin on her hand, her eyes glittering with mischief. Safe isn't living, Omar. Tell me, do you ever do anything reckless? Anything just for yourself? Or is your whole life just duty and discipline? He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment she thought she'd finally hit a wall he wouldn't let her cross. But then he spoke, his voice quieter this time, almost reflective. Discipline isn't the opposite of living, Miss Al-Fayed. Sometimes it's what keeps us alive. Amira blinked, caught off guard by the depth in his words. It wasn't the answer she'd expected, and for once, she didn't have a witty comeback ready. Well, that's depressing, she said after a beat, trying to shake off the sudden seriousness. You should try my method sometime. Ditch the discipline, embrace a little chaos. Who knows, you might even like it. Omar's eyes flicked to her in the rearview mirror, a shadow of something unreadable crossing his face before he quickly looked away. Chaos has consequences, he said simply. Amira sat back, studying him for a moment. Maybe, she said softly, but sometimes the consequences are worth it. They both fell silent after that, the tension thickening in the car once more. But this time, it wasn't the playful back and forth they were used to. It was heavier, charged with something neither of them wanted to name yet. By the time they reached the estate, Amira's mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts, none of which she could fully articulate. She stepped out of the car, glancing back at Omar as he held the door for her. For a moment she hesitated, as if wanting to say something, but deciding against it. Thanks for the ride, Omar, she said finally, her voice softer than usual. He gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. Always. As she walked toward the massive front doors, she felt his eyes on her once again, that same steady, intense gaze that seemed to linger even after she disappeared inside. And in her heart, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a game anymore. The days that followed were a dangerous dance between Amira and Omar, a game of push and pull where the lines between duty and desire blurred more with every passing moment. Amira, determined as ever to crack his impenetrable armor, became more creative and more reckless with her antics. One evening, while the household prepared for yet another lavish dinner party with high-profile guests, Amira hatched a plan that would either break Omar's resolve or finally prove to herself that he wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. As the guests arrived, dressed in designer suits and glittering gowns, Amira was nowhere to be found. Whispers began to ripple through the grand hall. Where was the host's charming daughter, the jewel of the Al-Fayed family? Her father, pacing impatiently, threw sharp glances at Omar, who stood calmly at his post, already suspecting her whereabouts. It wasn't long before he found her. Amira was perched on the rooftop balcony, barefoot, a glass of champagne in her hand, and a mischievous smile playing on her lips. The soft breeze toyed with her hair, and the glittering cityscape stretched endlessly before her. "Miss Al-Fayed," Omar said as he approached, his voice calm but carrying that unmistakable edge of authority. "Your father's guests are waiting for you." Amira didn't turn to face him. She simply raised her glass and replied, "Let them wait. Isn't that what they're best at? Waiting for someone else to decide everything for them?" Omar stepped closer, his brow furrowing. "You shouldn't be up here alone. It's not safe." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes sparkling with defiance. "Ah, there it is again. That word, safe. You really do love it, don't you?" She took a sip of her champagne, leaning casually against the railing. "Miss Al-Fayed." "Amira," she interrupted, setting the glass down on the ledge. "How many times do I have to tell you? Call me Amira." Omar exhaled slowly, as if her insistence on breaking every rule, no matter how small, tested every ounce of his patience. "Fine, Amira, but this isn't a game. You're putting yourself at risk." She stepped closer to him, her expression softening. "You say that like you actually care." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Amira took another step, now standing just inches away. Her voice dropped to a whisper, her gaze locking onto his. "Do you?" For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken emotions threatening to spill over. Omar's breath hitched almost imperceptibly, his usually stoic demeanor cracking just enough for her to catch the storm behind his eyes. "That's not the point," he said finally, his voice low but firm. Amira tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe it's the only point that matters." Omar's hands clenched at his sides, as if he were holding himself back from saying or doing something he'd regret. "You don't understand, Amira," he said, his tone softer now, almost pained. "This can't happen. It can't." "Why not?" she challenged, her voice steady but filled with vulnerability. "Because of my father? Because of your job? Or because you're too afraid to admit you feel something too?" Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Omar's gaze flickered to the open city behind her, then back to her face, as if searching for an answer he couldn't find. Amira took his hand, her touch gentle but firm, grounding him. "Tell me I'm wrong, Omar. Look me in the eye and tell me none of this matters to you. Tell me, and I'll stop." His breath hitched again, and for a brief, agonizing moment, it seemed like he might actually say it, that he'd draw the line and put an end to whatever was brewing between them. But instead, he pulled his hand away, his expression hardening once more. "I'm here to protect you, Amira," he said, stepping back. "That's all." Her heart sank, but she refused to let the pain show. Instead, she picked up her champagne glass, plastering on a defiant smile. "Then you'd better do your job and escort me back to the party." Omar gave a stiff nod, his face a mask of professionalism once more. "As you wish." But as they descended the staircase and returned to the glittering crowd, both of them knew that this moment, this night, had changed everything. The line they were so desperate to uphold was now barely a whisper, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. The days following the rooftop encounter were a whirlwind of emotions for both Amira and Omar. For her, it was a mix of frustration and defiance. For him, it was a constant battle between duty and desire. They avoided addressing the elephant in the room, but it loomed over them like a storm cloud, growing darker with each passing day. Amira, determined as ever, decided to test him further, pushing the boundaries of his professionalism. It was during one of her rebellious outings that things came to a head. Amira had slipped away from the estate, attending an underground art exhibit in a secluded part of the city. She had taken her best friend with her for cover, but her real motive was far less innocent: to see just how far Omar would go to stop her. When Omar found her, the scene was almost cinematic. Amira stood beneath a dimly lit chandelier, surrounded by abstract sculptures and moody paintings, laughing softly at something her friend had said. She wore a black dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her hair cascading down her back, and she looked every bit like a queen holding court. Omar strode in, his presence commanding as ever, and heads turned as the intensity of his gaze cut through the room. When he reached her, he spoke low, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "It's time to go, Amira." She tilted her head, pretending to consider it. "I'm not done yet. I like it here." "Now," he repeated, his voice firmer, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of something more: concern. She let out an exaggerated sigh, flashing an apologetic look at her friend. "Guess my bodyguard thinks I'm in mortal danger from all this art." Her friend stifled a laugh, and Omar's jaw clenched tighter. As they walked to the car, Amira couldn't resist poking the bear. "You're going to lecture me about safety again, aren't you?" "No," he replied, surprising her. "You already know the risks, you just don't care." She stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. "And you do?" Omar's eyes softened for a moment, but then his walls went up again. "It's my job, Amira." "Is it?" she pressed, stepping closer. "Because sometimes it feels like it's more than that." Omar hesitated, his defenses faltering for just a second before he said, "Let's get you home." The tipping point came a week later. Amira's father, concerned about recent threats to the family, assigned additional security measures. Omar was placed on even higher alert, and their interactions became more tense. One late night, Amira found him in the estate's private library. He sat at a desk, going over surveillance reports, looking unusually tired. Without thinking, she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You never take a break, do you?" she said softly. Omar looked up, his expression neutral, but his eyes showing a hint of exhaustion. "What do you need, Amira?" "I wanted to talk," she said, walking over to him. "Just us. No titles, no formalities. Just you and me." Omar sighed, setting down the reports. "You know that's not how this works." "Why not?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the desk, her voice firm but gentle. "What are you so afraid of?" "I'm not afraid," he said quickly, his tone defensive. "Then why do you keep pushing me away?" she challenged, leaning closer. "Why won't you admit what we both know is true?" Omar stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "Because it doesn't matter, Amira. Your life and mine, they're worlds apart. You're meant for grander things, and I'm just here to protect you." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "That's not your decision to make, Omar. You don't get to tell me who or what I'm meant for." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the weight of everything they'd been avoiding hung in the air between them. "You think this is easy for me," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Every moment I'm with you, I'm torn between doing my job and wanting—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Wanting what?" she pressed, stepping closer. He hesitated, then finally met her gaze. "Wanting you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening, but it lasted only a moment before Amira closed the gap between them. She reached up, cupping his face gently, and before either of them could think better of it, their lips met. It was a kiss filled with unspoken words, suppressed emotions, and years of restraint breaking free all at once. For a brief, stolen moment, the rest of the world disappeared. But when they broke apart, reality came crashing down. "We can't do this," Omar said, stepping back, his voice heavy with regret. "You keep saying that," Amira replied, her voice trembling. "But I'm not giving up on us, Omar, and neither should you." The next morning, Amira's father called Omar into his office. Unbeknownst to them, someone had seen their rooftop conversation and reported it to him. "You've done an excellent job protecting my daughter, Omar," Mr. Al-Fayed began, his tone measured. "But it seems your closeness with her has caused complications." Omar's heart sank, but he kept his face neutral. "I'm giving you a choice," Mr. Al-Fayed continued. "You can stay as her bodyguard and remain professional, or you can leave this family's service altogether." The stakes had never been higher, and with his heart and his duty at odds, Omar faced an impossible decision: to stay close to Amira but deny his feelings, or leave her life forever, knowing he might lose her for good. Omar stood in Mr. Al-Fayed's office, the weight of his words sinking in. He had always known this moment might come, but hearing it aloud felt like a hammer to his chest. "Amira, I've given you a chance to choose," Mr. Al-Fayed continued. "If you want to stay here, your professional distance is non-negotiable." Omar nodded grimly, his mind swirling. Could he truly walk away from Amira after everything they'd shared? But his duty as a bodyguard had always come first. That night, Amira found Omar on the balcony overlooking the city, deep in thought. She stepped closer, her breath catching when she saw his face, torn, conflicted. "Omar, what's going on?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the stillness. "I have to make a decision," he murmured, his voice betraying exhaustion. "I can't continue like this. I have to choose either you or my career." "Then choose me," she said, moving closer, taking his hand. "We can make it work." He pulled his hand back, his eyes dark with conflict. "You don't understand, Amira." "But I do," she whispered, taking a step closer, her voice barely audible. "I can't live a life of pretending anymore." A long silence stretched between them. He could feel her heart pounding, the desperation in her touch. Slowly, he reached for her, his face softening. "I want you, Amira, but I can't lose everything for it." She cupped his face in her hands, pulling him toward her. "Then we fight for this, together." And without another word, their lips met in a kiss that carried everything they had been holding back: the love, the pain, the impossible choices. The following week, Omar made his decision. He could no longer be her protector in the way he had once been. He quit his position, walking away from his life of duty, pushing aside the fear of consequences. As for Amira, she finally understood the power of making her own choices, with someone she trusted beside her. It wouldn't be easy, but with Omar by her side, she was ready to face whatever challenges came their way. The billionaire's daughter and the former bodyguard, now partners in life and love, with everything ahead of them.